The story of CaseLabs is a tragic one. CaseLabs was a small manufacturer of high-end PC cases that went out of business in August of 2018, bankrupted by a claimed combination of new 10% American tariff hikes and the loss of a major account, the latter of which was likely more responsible. We'd been in contact with CaseLabs in the months prior, and about a month before its own doom, we even received one of the SMA-8-A Magnum enclosures for review. Unfortunately, we had just started moving into the new office, and by the time the dust had settled, they were done for. CaseLabs almost certainly knew that the end was coming when they shipped our case, and probably knew that the review would never release while the company was still around. It stopped being a priority for us after that. Reviews of products that nobody can buy aren't especially helpful. But it's been sitting in storage ever since, unopened, and now that even more time has passed, it's worth a revisit to see what everyone is missing out on with CaseLabs gone. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their high-end thermal compounds. Thermal Grizzly makes cryonaut paste for high thermal performance and conductivity without being electrically conductive, so you don't have to worry about shorting components. Cryonaut is particularly good for replacing stock GPU pastes, as Cryonaut is a non-curing compound. Learn more at the link in the description below. A couple really important things here for this review. One, can you see me? This thing's pretty big. It's blocking 60% of our light. Sorry. Two, this is difficult to review. So typically our case reviews, if you're not familiar with them, are really detailed on the thermal and acoustic testing side of things. With this case, this isn't our standard, ignore this. With this case, our standard test bench is just comical. It's clearly not what this case was meant for. And that makes it difficult to do the thermals and noise and stuff like that, because there's no point. So we did do a few tests anyway, just for posterity's sake, but this case is meant for a few things. Meant for something like a server build, which is what Patrick is working on. You can see he has a lot of pride in it. And also things like dual water cooling loops, and there are plenty of those out there for you to see. But we really wanted to work on this as a server case. It's big, it should support dual socket boards. Ours is sort of jury-rigged in there, but we'll talk about that later. So it's a large case, and we have some B-roll shots of this thing that it looks a bit better than in its current state, but we'll talk about this shortly because it is important as well. So anyway, CaseLabs, the company originally opened with expert machinists. So that's what CaseLabs was before it became the company that made these. They were machinists. And that gives CaseLabs a very unique position in the market, in that you're buying from people who are skilled experts in making the thing they're selling, as opposed to most companies, and there's nothing wrong with this approach either, where it's experts who are skilled at designing the thing, and then they send it out to be made elsewhere. So that's where CaseLabs deviates from all of the other case companies. Unfortunately, it's also why it's really difficult to stay alive with that business model, because you're paying people who are going to be higher wage workers, in the US especially, and who are hands-on making these things without a massive automated factory and a huge supply chain and all the stuff that the big companies that pump out cases have the benefit of. So it makes CaseLabs cases genuinely boutique cases. And they're amazing in a lot of ways. We'll talk about them through Patrick's build notes. They're also expensive, like crazy expensive. This one was, we're not even fully sure because the company was gone. We can't check our order information. But when we requested the sample, the case would have been a retail equivalent of over $700 easily for the case. Like, that's what a computer costs if you build it on a budget. So it's interesting. Anyway, they are expensive boutique cases. They are high quality, high build quality, high attention to detail. There's some small things that CaseLabs missed in here. We'll talk about those. Given the circumstances, they might not have normally missed those things. And then the cases are often focused on things like dual liquid loops, really unique custom builds, and server type builds, which is what Patrick's working on here, dual socket build, and things like that. So CaseLabs also became somewhat famous during the Thermaltake scandal, where Thermaltake developed the name, quote, Thermaltake, because of allegations that Thermaltake had stolen CaseLabs design ideas. And we won't get into the details here on how those allegations ended or how that legal battle concluded, but it doesn't really matter, because what mattered was that CaseLabs and Thermaltake got into a big legal fight, and Thermaltake's much bigger. So regardless of who's right and who's wrong, when it's a legal battle, money's at play ultimately, and Thermaltake might have had more of that available. So these are all things that led to CaseLabs dying, and it's unfortunate to lose a company that really focuses on a high quality product, but also at the same time, that's what happens a lot of the time when there's no volume mover to really hold financial stability while you're working on building something like this, which took like months to even get, because things like powder coating, we don't think it was done in-house, because powder coating for the blue on the inside of this took something like between, I think they cited between 3 and 12 weeks, or 8 and 12 maybe. It was a lot. So you could be out of a case for 3 months after you order one because you're waiting for it to be powder coated. You don't have to get it powder coated, but it's just all these little things that make it difficult to compete, clearly. So let's talk about the case. We'll go through Patrick's build notes. The testing, there will be some discussion on testing. There are technically some thermal numbers. They are not important at all, because normally we're testing a reasonable case with some fans included, and it's tested in that config for the user who's building on that budget to use those fans, or maybe do a slight mod to them. This is it doesn't come with fans. It's meant for like dual loop liquid, or it's meant for a massive server, and so there's honestly no point. But we did a couple tests anyway, just because, I don't know, why not? We had already built it. So they're just not that important, so keep that in mind. Let's get into Patrick's build notes. The packing job was impressive in itself. Almost none of the case sections are thicker than 2 centimeters, so they were all stacked tightly and wrapped with paper. So much paper. A lot of paper. And then placed in a box that wasn't much larger than the finished product. Unlike mass-produced cases, CaseLabs enclosures shipped as a stack of completely disassembled parts to be assembled in IKEA-like style, complete with an 18-page instruction booklet. Our booklet was filled with pictures of a black case against a white background, printed entirely in color. So maybe toner refills were the secret third reason for the bankruptcy. The manual is thorough when it comes to basic assembly, but not all of the custom options we chose were covered, and it took some serious experimentation to figure out where the fan and LED mounts went properly. The core of the chassis is built from 2.5mm thick aluminum panels assembled with dozens of countersunk screws. We're no machining experts, but for a team as small as CaseLabs, 16 employees at the end, drilling, threading, and countersinking all those holes must have been a time-consuming operation. All the cable cutouts are lined with strips of rubber that have been carefully cut to just the right size. External panels are made of thinner 1.75mm aluminum, and the tempered glass window is just a flat rectangular sheet bolted onto one side. The whole package is surprisingly light given the size. We're used to XXL cases being covered in packing materials, packed with extra material around glass panels, and shipped all as one piece. A lot of cases also use heavier metals, for example, or are just less efficient in their packing. The SMA-8 is just a stripped down box that doesn't even come with fans. The all aluminum construction doesn't hurt either. It is very expensive though, and that thickness of aluminum is particularly steep for the bill of materials. Even though the quantity of screws is large, the variety is thankfully small. A Phillips head driver and a 5/16" hex socket driver are the only tools necessary, and the latter is supplied with the case. The front I/O includes USB 3.1 and an HDMI pass-through for VR. We chose a kit that includes an optional reset button, which is packed separately along with an alternate faceplate to accommodate it. A third faceplate could be ordered that was entirely blank except for the power button, but we didn't pick it up. All the cables are generously long, except for the ones on the power and the reset buttons, which struggle to reach their connections on the opposite corner of the case. The motherboard tray and PCI backplate assemble as one unit and fit into the rails of the case. So the system can be almost fully assembled outside of the case and then slid in. Technically, it also has standoffs if you wanted to use this as a test bench, but realistically, that's probably not too common of a use case. It's a tight fit, so there's no rattling once everything's seated, and this tight tolerance for fitment is part of what made the case such a high quality build. Maybe the most disappointing aspect of our specific SMA-8A was that it only supports standard ATX motherboards and the smaller eATX boards, despite its massive size. CaseLabs offered a $10 option for a longer motherboard tray that would support dual-socket eATX boards, but we either didn't choose it or didn't get it, so the whole front half of our case is usable only for reservoirs and nothing else. At least, not unless you have an active imagination and can build something like our dual-socket system by using a PCIe slot cover, a radiator screw, a nut, and some zip ties. Our case didn't even come with front fan mounts, which is potentially a normal thing. It just depends. These cases are fully customizable to order. So if we specified that we wanted them in our order, we would have gotten them. But at the same time, the company was shutting down, and we're not really sure what the specification was anymore because it's probably one of the last things they threw together before shipping out. It's impossible to tell at this point, unfortunately, specifically what we ordered. Either way, we jury-rigged our case to fit longer boards by double stacking standoffs so that the board could clear the forward section of the case. It doesn't seem like there was a good reason to buy the more limited ATX version of the case. It leaves more room for reservoirs in the front, but even the SSI EEB version has plenty of space. Cable management is accomplished with aluminum bars that screw into the rear of the motherboard tray. These bars are definitely sturdy, but clearance is tight for 24-pin power cables, especially sleeved ones that can't be flattened out. There are barely any cable tie points and none big enough to fit the Velcro straps that we would like to use. None of this is especially important though, because the sheer amount of space behind the motherboard tray and in the bottom chamber of the case mean that an entire power supply's worth of cables could be hidden without any management at all. There were also a few minor issues. Lifting either side panel off the hinges requires moving the top panel because it slightly overhangs them. The screw holes for the rear exhaust fan were drilled slightly smaller than the ones on the rest of the case. We're not quite sure why, but we did have to use a different screw. Most of the fan mounts are single size, designed to fit 120mm fans and nothing else, but it's not like this is hidden from you at purchase. And then there are some features lacking that are common in the factory-produced cases that we usually review, the things that are mass-produced in massive factories in Asia. The expansion slot and drive bay screws are difficult to access because they're obstructed by other parts of the case. There are no screwdriver cutouts, which makes it sort of annoying sometimes when working with PCIe expansion slots. Filters and fan mounts could be purchased separately, and it seems like these are one of the few CaseLabs products that are still actively being sold. So if you did want those, you could still get them, but just not the case. Using the Internet Archive to look at the CaseLabs website reveals quite a few custom options. In order, case color, black default, $35 for gunmetal or white. Optional, two-tone color scheme, $25 extra. Form factor, ATX or eATX default, $10 for SSI EEB or wider eATX, which we really wish we had gotten, but we might not have asked for, we're not sure. Standard or reverse case orientation, case floor with either lighting mounts, which were brand new at the time they shut down, or a removable plate. Motherboard chamber floors, solid default, or $15 for the 3x 120mm fan cutouts and 5 1/4 cutout. A side door, solid default, $30 acrylic, $50 glass. Top cover, ventilated, solid, $20 for 39mm extended height ventilation. And $70 for 120mm extended height, also ventilated. More than 20 different options for various front cover, fan mount combinations, all boiling down to whether they're ventilated, solid, or tempered glass. Motherboard tray styles can even be changed. So the case is 100% customizable, is what we're getting at. You could have, there are 8 slot default motherboard trays. You can do $34 for 8 slot plus 2 vertical and a riser cable. You do $36 for 5 vertical and a riser cable, $56 for 5 vertical and 2 riser cables. Front I/O is customizable. You can do none. You can do USB 3.0 by 2 and audio, by 2 being 2 of them. $35 for additional USB 3.1 Type-C and HDMI. $35 for a second side fan mount. $25 for an LED strip mounting kit, and $29 for the reset switch retrofit kit. All of this is on top of a $650 base price. It's absolutely crazy how customizable this case is. Cooler Master wishes they could be this customizable with their Maker Series cases. It's ridiculous, and this isn't really something that you could do with the normal factory mass production setup. It has to be done at a smaller scale because it's just not feasible otherwise. So CaseLabs really had something unique there. Unfortunately, it's also what makes the cases really expensive, and it makes it hard to run and stay in business when you have that type of model. Small operation, expensive product, and a lot of competition in the market. Testing the SMA-8A with our standard hardware is a bit of a joke, since it's specifically geared toward overkill liquid cooling loops, the case that is. Our air-cooled bench uses a full ATX board, but it looks like a mini ITX board huddled down in one corner of the massive case. We chose to add 4 1900 RPM Lee & Bora fans for testing because this test doesn't particularly matter too much, and because Lee and Der Bauer sent us 9 of them and we can't figure out what else to use them for. 2 were placed under the top of the power supply shroud as intake, bottom, and 1 was at the CPU cooler level as top intake. 1 more fan was in the single rear slot as rear exhaust, and we didn't bother doing any tests beyond this for reasons already stated. So, there's no stock baseline because this doesn't ship with fans and it's not meant for that use. Honestly, well, let's just get through them. CPU temperature during the torture test, with just 1 fan pointed down at the cooler and 1 pulling exhaust out, was 46.5 degrees Celsius, one of the coolest results we've gotten, and close to the H500M mesh. The massive size of the case means that with any airflow at all, it's practically equivalent to an open air bench, and then you just use the fans to guide the air. We did try torture testing without any fans at all, but even in a case this big, because it's still not purely open air, it caused overheating problems, so we dropped that test. GPU torture temperature was 44.6 degrees Celsius over ambient, lower than any of the other cases on the chart. That's because 2 1900 RPM fans were directly blasting the cooler, with air pulled in from the vast empty chamber at the bottom of the case. We could have populated 2 slots directly under the GPU for an even lower temperature, but we put 1 under the GPU and 1 farther towards the front so that the air is split and also benefits the CPU. GPU temperature in Firestrike was slightly higher at 46.1 degrees, but it usually is slightly higher. And again, this is the lowest temperature on the chart, approached only by the SL600M. That's not particularly fair since we did put 1900 RPM fans into a $700 case, but you get the idea. The right configuration and enough brute force makes anything good. CPU temperatures when rendering our Blender test file exclusively on the CPU averaged 36.6 degrees Celsius over ambient. That's tied with the half-X and nearly tied with the open air Cougar Conquer. The fans we installed are higher quality than most cases ship with, but again, it's a $650 case minimum that's designed for liquid cooling. GPU temperature during the combined GPU and CPU render averaged 21.7 degrees Celsius over ambient, which is still lower than anything else on the chart. Again, almost even with the SL600M. So conclusion, I'm still not sure if you can even see me. It's very dark. This case is gigantic. You can't buy the case as it was intended to be bought. You can't buy the case at all at this point. So you can't buy from CaseLabs, at least not the case. You can't buy with all the options. And that's really where the case was impressive, was just how customizable it was. Because when you bought from CaseLabs, as you heard when I went through all of the different ways you could customize the case, it was your case when it was done. You basically sent them a spec and paid them, and then they made a case for you. That's pretty cool service. It's expensive service, and clearly not something that most people would ever pay for. I mean, you know, we probably wouldn't pay for it, because just financially there are so many, not necessarily better, but there are so many more financially in our position, responsible options, or maybe just cheaper options in general, and they're still suited for the job. So that's the difficulty, and you know, it's the same argument for any other boutique brand in an industry where it's hard to survive, it's expensive because it's low volume, and it's low volume because it's expensive, and it's also low volume because it's people who are extremely concerned about quality to a point that they just don't trust anyone else to really do it, or at least not at the same level of mass production as these larger companies where they're okay with pushing out $50, $100 cases, $150 cases that still have lots of flaws, because they know at the end of the day, what matters is that it's good enough. And you have to settle for good enough when you're dealing with mass production, because you'll never make anything otherwise. So CaseLabs really deviated from that. And that's where it shines, because it's so customizable. But there may be some stock left with CaseLabs at various distributors of theirs. There might be some used cases on eBay, but the usual, is it worth it? Conclusion to our review is not possible here. So this is not a proper review. You can't buy the product. So it's not, is it worth it? It's not, are the thermals any good? It's, was it cool? And the answer to was it cool is yes, it's absolutely cool. It's really well built. It does have flaws, so let's, no rose-tinted glasses here. There are flaws, we listed them. But it's cool. And this is a case that was more or less hand-built, and that's very interesting. So, again, it's 16 employees at a small company, a lot of whom are machinists, and that's not a story you get at a lot of places. So the giant, opulently expensive case that this is what makes it inherently interesting, especially as a post-mortem. It's sad, however, that no more will be made. We understand why that's the case, because expensive, and losing a massive client is probably the biggest blow they took. The tariff hike does hurt a bit, but at that time, there was discussion of the 25% tariffs, but they hadn't been enacted, and they still haven't at time of filming. 10% tariffs, we believe, had been enacted at that point, or were very close to it. So technically, there was a tariff hike. It was 10%. It did affect this company. They use a lot of aluminum. It probably affected the bottom line. But you can raise prices if you have to. And 10% on $600 is certainly a lot, $660 now. But when you're at that price, the customers might still pay it. So it's really more likely the default of an account or the loss of a big account that killed the company, not necessarily just the tariffs, although we certainly would believe that those also impacted them. So it's an expensive case. It was made with expertise. It was made with a lot of care and a lot of aluminum. We'll probably be using ours to house the dual Xeon system that we're currently working on. We're troubleshooting it. That's why it's a mess like this. And probably for future content pieces too. So keep an eye out for this thing again. It's extremely likely we use this for a dual Xeon system. It's also likely that we end up doing an open loop on it, because that's kind of what the case was made for. So check back for that. But you've got the review on build quality. You have a little bit of history on it. And then you have the, a couple thermal numbers that are totally pointless. So anyway, here's what we want to know. How did you feel about CaseLabs? Whether you knew about them before or you just learned about them today, yeah, how do you feel about this type of product? Even if you're not ever going to buy one, what's your feeling? And do you miss that the company is gone, or do you just not care because the market does what the market does? What are your thoughts? Post them below. Subscribe for more. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. You can buy a shirt like this one, the GPU Disappointment Build shirt, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out there as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.